Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
That extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
A really popular slogan when it comes to religious discussions like miracles, God's existence, and the resurrection of Jesus is that
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
the slogan itself goes back to the late astronomer Carl Sagan, and it's used as an objection when Christians argue for things like God's existence, miracles, and the resurrection of Jesus. While the slogan at first might seem like a good objection to things like a miracle claim, it's got a lot of issues with it. First, let's cover what I call the ambiguity problem. Most of you have probably heard this before, but what do we mean by extraordinary? Somebody might point to the dictionary as a definition, but the problem is dictionaries don't prescribe a meaning, they just describe the colloquial use of meaning. Somebody still might mean something else than just what the dictionary means. So do we just mean infrequent? Does extraordinary mean that it just goes against natural law? Or is an extraordinary claim just something that goes against what you believe about the world? I don't want to beat a dead horse with this particular topic. Many people have covered it already, but it's worth bringing up. We just need to be clear about what we're saying when we're trying to make progress in these types of intellectual discussions. Instead, what I really want to cover is a somewhat novel approach to this slogan. Whenever we're dealing with evidence, we are necessarily dealing with probabilities. For example, philosophers of science and philosophers of evidence give the following as the positive relevance definition of evidence. E is evidence that H, if and only if, the probability of H given E is greater than the probability of H. Put very simply, a data point is evidence for any hypothesis if it just raises the probability of the hypothesis. So given that we're dealing with probabilities, then we can translate this slogan into probabilistic terms. And there's two probabilistic frameworks we can translate this into: a frequentist interpretation and a Bayesian interpretation. Now, if we start with the frequentist interpretation of probability theory, we'll quickly see how translating the slogan into a frequentist approach yields many issues. On frequentism, we assign probabilities by looking at how many occurrences of an event happen within a given reference class, hence the name frequentism. So if the skeptic wants to object to a miracle account by translating the slogan to infrequent accounts require extraordinary evidence, now we actually have something to work with. And this only partially gets rid of the ambiguity problem that I mentioned earlier, and in turn introduces some other problems. So the first thing I want to just point out is now we have a disambiguation problem with this metric. Are we saying the frequency of actual miracle counts are low? Are we saying the frequency of miracle claims are low? Are we saying that the number of observed miracles are low? These particular questions matter. What are we actually testing for when it comes to frequencies? If it's the frequency of actual miracle claims, then how does the skeptic know what the actual frequency of miracle claims are? If it's the number of observed miracle claims, is the skeptic talking about miracle claims that they have observed or that humanity has observed? Now, besides the disambiguation problem, I think this frequentist approach has other issues with it that are bigger. This is called the reference class problem, and this is the problem that arises when we attempt to define our reference class. The more detailed we get, the less trials we find. Here's a non-religious example. Say we want to know what the probability of me getting cancer is. Well, I'm a human, so we should start off with that reference class. But there's more variables at play as to whether or not I'll get cancer than just me being human. Looking at the general statistical data as to how often humans get cancer, it's not going to be very helpful for telling me what the odds of me getting cancer are. So let's narrow down the reference class. What about humans that are Greek males? That might get us closer, but there's more to me than just being Greek and male. I've also been exposed to chemical fires when I was a firefighter. I've had multiple MRIs. I have a family history of cancer. I eat healthy. I live in a particular area with certain air conditions. I've never smoked a cigarette in my life. I really like cheeseburgers. You get the point. There are so many variables that can be part of whether or not I'll get cancer. But notice this. As I get more detailed with my reference class, the further away I get from actually getting a probability of me getting cancer on frequentism. The reason why is because the more details I add into my reference class, the smaller my reference class gets. The smaller my reference class gets, the closer the probability of me getting cancer is 0 or 1. And this is a very counterintuitive result. The more evidence and data I have, the closer I should be getting to the probability of what I'm trying to figure out. But if my reference class gets narrowed down to 1, me, now the probability is either 0 or 1. And the problem here is that no reference class is more valid than the other. Given frequentism, probabilities are relative, and this is generally a very counterintuitive result. Intuitively, the more evidence and data that I have to work with, the closer I should be able to get to the probability of whatever it is that I'm trying to figure out. More data should not result in relativization. Besides that, there's other issues with frequentism that I won't get into in this video. I can make more in the future on this if you want. That leaves us with another interpretation of probability theory, a Bayesian interpretation of probability theory. Bayesian interpretations of probability theory deal with prior probabilities and likelihood ratios. Prior probabilities are the probability of the hypothesis or event in question, given what we already know about the world, background knowledge. And the likelihood ratio is the output once you divide the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis divided by the probability of the evidence given any competing theory or the negation of the hypothesis. And that likelihood ratio helps us figure out whether the evidence is confirming or disconfirming of the thing we're testing for. The output of the likelihood ratio then tells us how confirming the evidence is for the hypothesis or its negation or competing theory. Then if we look at something called the odds form of Bayes theorem, there's two ratios we can look at to help us determine the posterior probability: the ratio of the priors and the likelihood ratio of the evidence. You get the final probability by multiplying the ratio of the priors by the ratio of the evidence. Anything over 1 confirms the numerator, and anything under 1 confirms the denominator. With all of this understanding in place, now we can translate the slogan into Bayesian terms. In other words, the skeptic can say one of two things or a combination of both. Either it's the case they're saying that the prior probability is too low for any evidence to overcome, or they're saying that the likelihood ratio is just not strong enough to overcome the prior. Now here's the problem. Once we translate this into probabilistic terms, we discover that the skeptic has a burden of proof now. Say I present to you a case for what I think is an authentic miracle. I give the testimony of people involved, medical documentation, etc., etc. I then outline why it's more likely that God intervened on this person's behalf than the fact that the doctors were mistaken or that this was an elaborate hoax. And then you respond, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If we translate that into Bayesian terms, what you're inevitably going to have to defend is that the prior probability is too low and or that the likelihood ratio is too low. If you want to say that the prior is low, give an argument as to why the prior is low. If you think the likelihood ratio is low, you have to tell us why you think the likelihood ratio is low. In either case, you're making an objection and you have a burden of proof. In either case, the skeptic will have to argue that the probability of the evidence given some competing theory to a miracle claim is higher than the probability of the evidence given a miracle happening, and or argue that the prior probability of any particular miracle in question is too low for the likelihood ratio to overcome. So to be clear, I'm not debunking the slogan here. All I've done here is translate it into probabilistic terms. That way we can actually extract meaning out of the slogan and move on with these discussions. But given these considerations, the slogan itself isn't really much of an objection. The translation of the slogan is an objection, and that's met with the burden of proof to actually demonstrate why the prior is too low or the likelihood ratio is too low or both. That's what's at the heart of the objection. So the skeptic needs to do more than just say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Again, they need to argue why the prior is too low or the likelihood ratio is too low or both. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it was helpful. Please like and subscribe and all that stuff. If you want to help me continue to make videos like this and give you guys resources for handling these types of things, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter.